A 20-year-old Oxford student named Neil Moss found himself trapped, unable to move. That moment marked the beginning of a massive rescue operation filled with tension, heroism, and dramatic twists. The main character of today's story is Oscar Hackett Neil Moss, just 20 years old. His father, Eric Moss, owned a cotton mill in Manchester and was a well-off man. As a gentleman of his standing, he sent his son to Oxford, where Neil studied philosophy. Neil was tall and slender, nearly 6'3", an athletic young man with a passion for exploration. He was especially drawn to the mysteries underground, which is why he soon joined the British Speleological Association. That name sounded impressive, but in reality, the chapter Neil belonged to was more like a casual student club than a serious society of seasoned cavers. On Sunday, March 22, 1959, a group of 8 young cavers set out on an expedition to Peak Cavern, a famous cave near the village of Castleton in Derbyshire, England. The cave had been known for centuries. Its main entrance lay just 150 meters from the village's main street. Locals and tourists often wandered inside, though they rarely went beyond the first chambers. Neil's group, however, planned to push much deeper, down nearly 1,000 feet, into less explored sections of the cave. Their primary goal was a newly discovered vertical fissure found only 2 weeks earlier. In earlier videos, many of you asked me to go into more detail about how these routes are navigated, so this time I'll slow down and explain it better. After entering the cave, the team moved through a tight tunnel with a telling name, the Dirty Ducks. The only way through was single file, and during rains, the passage flooded with water, turning into a mess of sticky mud. Once through, they reached a corridor called Boulder Passage. This section was relatively easy. After about 150 meters, they came to a 3-meter climb that led them into an upper chamber. From there, they entered a tunnel lined with long, hanging stalactites, known as the Needle's Eye Passage. It didn't give them much trouble either. At the end of the passage was a vertical chimney in a ceiling. Climbing up, the group found themselves in a small chamber, knee-deep in thick silt. Wading through mud and water, they finally reached what many considered the most beautiful spot in the cave, the stalagmite chamber, today known as Moss Chamber. This spacious hall was filled with stunning, towering stalagmites. It was a place to stop, take in the beauty, and catch their breath. By then, they'd been underground for over an hour, nearly 1,000 feet below the surface. And technically, this was where the journey could have ended. Their goal was right there. It lay in that very hall, hidden in the floor itself. A narrow vertical crack plunged into darkness, perhaps concealing more chambers or other secrets of the cave. It had been found only a couple of weeks earlier, and no one had yet dared to descend. Whoever managed to pass through it first would be something of a pioneer, a true trailblazer. Here's how eyewitnesses later recalled it. We knew the shaft was narrow, twisting like a spiral, and would be very difficult to get through. We estimated its depth at around 40 feet, but to be safe we lowered a 70-foot rope ladder. At first glance, the passage seemed wide enough for someone about 5'7" to squeeze through. But Neil Moss was much taller, closer to 6'3". Still, he was so determined to try that nothing could stop him. And the shaft really was as bad as it looked. It dropped downward in a corkscrew twist, demanding incredible flexibility, forcing a person to literally contort their body at every turn. At its tightest, the space narrowed to just 18 inches across, leaving no room to turn or move properly. But Neil had already made up his mind. Pushing the rope ladder ahead of him, he began the descent. The deeper he went, the more the shaft veered away from vertical, twisting tighter like a screw. Neil writhed his way around the bends, constantly shouting back to his teammates above, assuring them that everything was fine. He wasn't tied to a safety rope. It would have only gotten in the way. His only lifeline was that rope ladder. The first squeezes he managed to get through, thanks to his natural flexibility. But soon he reached another bend, this one blocked by a massive boulder. Neil tried to shift the stone to force a way forward, but the space was far too tight. He couldn't get the leverage. With no other choice, he decided to climb back up. That's when the real problem revealed itself. On the way down, He had barely used the ladder at all, gravity and the narrow rock walls had guided him. Now, trapped in a dead end, he couldn't bend his leg enough to reach the next rung below him. He twisted and strained, trying to wriggle upward, then realized something terrifying. His shoulders were jammed tight. He lunged forward, only to wedge himself in even deeper. He tried to slide back down to adjust, but the rock walls wouldn't let him. He was stuck fast. Panicked, Neil began shouting for help. His teammates scrambled to assist. The obvious solution was to haul him up by the rope ladder. They pulled hard, and Neil actually moved, just a little, maybe 16 inches. But then the metal rungs of the ladder wedged crossways in the narrow shaft, locking against the rock walls. The ladder was stuck solid. Now Neil couldn't move up or down. His legs couldn't bend enough to push off the rung below, and his arms were pinned tight against his sides. There was no space to maneuver. So his teammates tried something else, tie a rope around him and yank him out by force, like pulling a cork from a bottle. From deep inside the shaft came Neil's cries for help. Situations like this, while terrifying, weren't unheard of in caving. The next logical step was clear. Someone had to go down, tie the rope to him properly, and then haul him back to the surface. One of his friends climbed down and did just that, but their gear was nowhere near up to the task. The rope was too thin, and under the strain it snapped. They tried again, and once more it failed. The sharp rock edges along the twisted shaft cut straight through the rope. It's hard to imagine what Neil must have felt as scraps of broken rope fell onto his head while his teammates failed again and again to pull him free. The bends of the shaft made it impossible to apply enough force to move him. His cries grew louder and more desperate. Watching the rope snap over and over pushed him into panic and despair. Neil tried to fight his way out on his own, thrashing, twisting, struggling, but only wedged himself tighter. He couldn't bend his legs to reach a rung, nor could he tuck his elbows to push himself upward. The stone walls held him fast, like a vice. At that point, his friends realized just how serious the situation was. Several scrambled to the surface to get help. Neil had become trapped around 3:30 in the afternoon. Within just a few hours, volunteers from across England began converging on Peak Cavern. The rescue effort escalated quickly and on a massive scale. Whether it was because Neil's father was a man of influence or simply because people wanted to help, no one could say for sure. But soon there were hundreds of volunteers on site, joined by the Royal Air Force, police, and even the Navy. The cave was easy to reach, sitting practically inside the village itself. The real danger lay elsewhere. In those crucial hours of preparation, carbon dioxide had begun to build up inside the shaft, leaving less and less oxygen to breathe. Eyewitnesses later recalled that Neil's behavior turned strange. One teammate, George Cooper, said Neil grew unusually quiet, as if he didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. At one point, he even suggested we leave him there and go grab some food. Over time, his voice became weaker and more incoherent, until finally he slipped into delirium. By then, several experienced cavers had descended into the cave and reached the mouth of the shaft. One by one they tried to push through to Neil, but the carbon dioxide was overwhelming. 3 rescuers passed out inside the narrow passage, saved only because they were quickly hauled out by rope. Only the 4th, Ron Peters, managed to reach Neil, risking his own life to do so. Peters forced his way into the deadly shaft, breathing the poisoned air, and somehow got a rope tied around Neil's chest. It was a truly heroic act. Peters could have been trapped himself, but he pressed on, determined to give Neil a chance. Above, rescuers pulled on the rope. But even in the upper chambers, the bad air was spreading. Everyone there was gasping and dizzy. Peters could hear Neil groan and struggle to breathe. The rope was crushing his chest, squeezing the air out of him. Later, Peters told reporters, that boy was jammed in the shaft like he'd been screwed into it. The only way to free him was to rotate his body and literally twist him out. I could barely reach him. At one point, I clamped my teeth onto his clothing. That's how close I had to get. He was already wrapped in rope, but it snapped. I tied a new one onto the remains of the old, and we managed to lift him about 18 inches. Meanwhile, rescuers were staggering out of the cave one after another, overcome by the fumes. The carbon dioxide left them delirious, and many crawled out to the surface in states of severe poisoning, wild-eyed, faces red, gasping for breath. Peters himself was carried to a hospital, exhausted and barely alive after inhaling so much gas. It was becoming painfully clear, if the rescue didn't speed up, within a couple of hours there would be no one left to save. The Royal Air Force rushed in oxygen tanks, and by nightfall they had them set up at the mouth of the shaft, pumping fresh air through pipes straight down to Moss. Conditions improved slightly, but the oxygen was still desperately insufficient. The plan was to keep air flowing nonstop through the night. Experts agreed. The only real chance was to send down someone exceptionally small and slim, an experienced caver who might squeeze closer to Neil and attempt to free him. By morning, a woman named June Bailey arrived. She was indeed petite, a Manchester typist who spent her spare time exploring caves. June descended into the shaft, managed to reach Neil, and studied the situation closely. When she resurfaced, her conclusion was blunt. The only way to pull him through the tightest section was to break his collarbones and fold his shoulders inward. It was a desperate plan, but there were no alternatives, and the rescuers reluctantly agreed. Yet no one could make another attempt. Each person who went down immediately blacked out from the carbon dioxide. By Monday morning, nearly 24 hours after Moss had first entered the cave, his gurgling breath could still be heard at the entrance to the shaft. 18-year-old rescuer Ron Fryer told reporters, "The air down there is just awful. It's saturated with carbon dioxide, and the headaches are unbearable. We were told it wasn't safe to stay more than 10 minutes. I kept using the oxygen, but in the end I had to give up. I think I got within about 10 feet of him. We could hear his breathing clearly. By then, Neil was so weak he couldn't eat the food passed to him or even manage to put on an oxygen mask." One rescuer who made it back to the surface reported, "He's still muttering something, but we can't make out the words anymore." A doctor who had spent 9 hours inside the cave finally emerged and said grimly, "Now only a miracle can save him. His breathing is growing weaker by the minute." Compressed air tanks were brought in to try to flush out the carbon dioxide. But with so many people crowding the cave, the microclimate shifted. It grew hot, damp, and suffocating. Mud coated the walls, the ladder, even the ropes. Inside the shaft, all that could be seen now was a mud-choked passage. Somewhere down there, Neil remained trapped. Rescuers tried forcing the rock wider with crowbars and even began digging a parallel tunnel, but the stone was too hard, and there was no way to bring in heavy equipment. Then rain set in, flooding sections of the cave. The passage known as the Dirty Ducks became completely submerged, raising the threat of a deadly flood. To prevent more casualties, operations were temporarily suspended. When the rain finally stopped, rescuers returned with an RAF doctor to the shaft where Neil's breathing had last been heard. This time, only silence awaited them. Neil Moss was officially declared dead on Tuesday, March 24, 1959. Later, Dr. Huckett admitted it was the first and only time in his career that he pronounced someone dead without ever laying eyes on the body. All those long hours, Neil's father, Eric Moss, waited anxiously at the cave entrance. When he was finally told of his son's death, he made a firm and heartbreaking decision. The body would not be recovered. The risks were too great, and more lives could be lost. Instead, Neil would remain in the cave forever. Rescuers sealed the shaft with stones, turning it into his final resting place. The Grand Stalagmite Chamber was later renamed Moss Chamber in his honor. In a later interview, Neil's mother admitted that her son had never truly been an experienced caver. For their heroic efforts, Ron Peters was awarded the George Medal, while his fellow rescuers, Les Selman, John Thompson, and Flight Lieutenant John Carter, received the British Empire Medal. Even so, the rescue operation drew heavy criticism. Newspapers accused the team of incompetence and poor organization, blaming them for the failure. Some outlets went further, attacking caving itself as a reckless pursuit and calling for it to be banned altogether. Yet, out of this tragedy came change. The Neil Moss incident became the catalyst for creating new standards and procedures for cave rescue operations across Britain. His story resonated far beyond Derbyshire, making headlines not only in the UK but around the world. In 2004, it was reimagined in the novel One Last Breath. To this day, Neil Moss's body rests deep within Moss Chamber in Peak Cavern, a silent reminder for the cavers who sometimes descend there. So, what do you think of the story? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Many people watch without subscribing, but for me, every click makes a huge difference. And of course, feel free to recommend the channel to your friends.